Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. And welcome to our sixth session of Islamicate book reviews. My name is al-Azami, and please join myself and Omar Anchassi for a discussion of the book Muhammad's Body, Baraka Networks and Prophetic Assemblages by Michael Muhammad Knight.
Hold it up.
Omar will be introducing the book. Omar will be introducing the book in just a moment. The typical format that we have is we have a discussion of the book on the part of Omar for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then I'll take over.
Just by way of summary and introduction.
And then, I'll be engaged in a conversation with Omar for probably around half an hour after his presentation. And then we're more than happy to take questions and comments, inshallah. So without further ado, I want to actually launch in to the conversation. So please, Omar, introduce the book to us, inshallah.
So this is, Michael Muhammad Knight, I should say something about him, is a very prolific author. And I think this is his, 13th or 14th book. This one in particular is very original and interesting. It is theoretically sophisticated. He uses the framework of Deleuze and Guattari to discuss the Prophet's body and what the Prophet's body can do, as depicted in the Sirah Maghazi literature, which we discussed in last week's episode, and also focusing on the Hadith corpus. No pun intended, the book is organized into 5 body chapters that explore a range of themes, focusing on particular aspects of the Prophet's body and its interaction with the wider world, or how the outside world impinges on his body, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he explores a couple of themes. There are motifs that recur throughout the book. Knight is not really focused on the question of historicity at all, though he does stop to pass isnads and comment that such and such is a Kufan or Basran or Zubayrid isnad. But he is interested in the transformation and continuities as well in the depiction of the Prophet's body and its attributes and traits and powers, you could say, over time. So he does pick up on how the depiction of this body and what it can do shifts, but there are also substantial continuities as well. So to give one example, already in the earliest texts, such as Ma'mar bin Rashid's Maghazi work that we discussed last week, one finds that the Prophet's saliva has, you could say, magical properties. He uses it to heal his companions. He spits into a well and the water immediately becomes abundant. He rubs some of his saliva into the eye of Ali in one later report, and it is immediately kind of healed of all defects. That is one example, and this is specifically with saliva. This is something you find in early texts and in later texts, but the characterization of the Prophet's body does change over time. Just to give you a sense of the temporal range of the sources consulted in this work, we begin with Sirah Maghazi texts like Ma'mar, his Maghazi, like Ibn Ishaq in its various recensions, Ibn Sa'd, and so on, and the Hadith corpuses, including the well-known works, but going as late as kind of historical or quasi-Hadith texts such as Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's Tarikh Baghdad, Abu Nu'aym's Hilyat al-Awliya, and so on. And really, I think one of the underlying points Knight is trying to make, because he's very interested in this question of the construction of Sunnism and how Sunnism emerges over time, and he really stresses the point that Sunnism is not one thing and does not have one particular view on any of the questions he explores in this book. You could say that over time there is an increasing investment in the ability of the Prophet's body to transcend itself and to reach beyond itself. And I know in various episodes in previous weeks we've explored the cult of saints, for instance. What does it mean that the Prophet has passed away? How can believers still sort of commune with him? Are prophets alive in their graves, according to one report? Praying, and in what sense do they enjoy this life? How is the prophetic body distinct from other human bodies? What marks it out as significant or unusual? And even within, so he explores these different strands, layers of the hadith corpus, and the impression one really gets when reading this book is, first of all, the common sense insight that it's not a single thing, but that Sunnism and this kind of hadith corpus outside the canonical sources and even within them is really a cacophony of voices, whether on the Prophet's body or other subjects. And you find some reports, and he gives a number of examples of this, some reports that appear in early sources that are then omitted by the 6 so-called canonical Sunni works of hadith, and he discusses the idea of canonicity somewhat and in the course of Sunni identity and its formation. So they're omitted from this exposition, and then they reappear with a vengeance, as it were, in later sources like Mu'jam al-Tabarani. So he's not, he doesn't focus at least on the question of historicity, but one does get a very clear sense of historical development. Some discussions kind of reoccur throughout the entirety of the period. Others are novel, you could say, to later periods. And these are some of the author's interesting findings. So you have a range of chapters, as I said. One especially interesting one, given the author's, he's very upfront about his sort of feminist scholarly genealogy and commitments. There is an excellent chapter on the sex of revelation, prophethood and gendered bodies, where he looks not just at the gendering of the Prophet himself, but of the angels, and even indeed in this theological controversy about the Prophet's vision of God. Did the Prophet see God? If so, how? And so on. And also he tries to ground, especially in the early part of the book, these discussions in their late antique Mediterranean context. So all of the descriptions we read in works of Shama'il, for instance, about the Prophet's appearance, how did he square with like ancient norms of physiognomy, this discipline of firasa? We find the Prophet always imagined by his companions as kind of middling stature, neither too tall nor too short, neither too dark nor too light. And some interesting discussion of the Prophet's color, very interesting subject. This does reflect the kind of ideals of the discourse of physiognomy. Excess is bad, and the body and its external appearance mirror one's internal disposition. So this kind of middling quality, as we'd expect, is a good one. And also an interesting chapter on interventions on the Prophet's body, whether through what he humorously terms angelic heart surgery, the inshirah al-sadr, the opening of the Prophet's chest, and as well as this kind of cacophony of voices, night does always present multiple versions, multiple variants of the same report. To mention one example, on this episode of the opening of the Prophet's breast, we have multiple variants, and scholars disagree in various hadith texts and seerah texts when exactly this took place. Some date it to the Prophet's childhood, others say it took place, the two kind of major accounts, in childhood and shortly before the Isra. Others would say it happens immediately before the first revelation the Prophet receives. So multiple accounts, and again different versions of what happened, varying in various details. So in one marginal version, it is not two angels that come to the Prophet and remove something from his heart, but it is in fact two large white birds who are kind of angels in bird form, you could perhaps say. Right. And with Sunnism's increasing investment in things like prophetic protection from error, or asma, sometimes translated as infallibility, these texts also undergo a certain amount of change, and the way they're interpreted and understood by authors shifts over time. So as well as emphasizing how this is really a cacophony of voices and not just one thing, This archive of impressions of the Prophet and his body is, you can think of it as a kind of epigraphy. This image or metaphor Karen Bauer uses when discussing Quran commentary. Think of layers of rock, sort of one on top of another. It's not that the Sunni hadith corpus comes along, or the Sahaba Sitta come along and manage to suppress all the alternate versions. But all of these are always already available insofar as the texts are available to us. And these kind of competing strands and layers and perspectives on the Prophet body, they're available for people to kind of appeal to in their argument. So I think these are some of the key themes and key contributions of the text. So hopefully you've got a sense of it, or the audience has a good sense of what it's doing. There's a lot going on in the text, I should stress, so yes, but hopefully some of this will come out in our conversation.
Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. I have a bit of an echo. So just give me 1 minute. I don't know if that's gone now. Okay. Yes. So the Jazakumullah khair. I mean, that's a very useful overview, and I think you've touched on a whole host of themes that could take this conversation on for a good period of time, much beyond the sort of hour that we have allocated for it. And of course, people are more than welcome to ask questions. They will come up in the chat, and we can share them, hopefully address them in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the conversation as well. But I wanted to sort of home in on a few themes that you've sort of highlighted, and perhaps I can address them in turn, and we can engage in this hopefully fascinating conversation in a sense on a fascinating book. One is the way in which you just described Sunnism and the construction of Sunnism within sort of the narrative that Michael Knight has put forward, and you've referenced Karen Bauer's work. I'm not entirely sure which work of hers you're referencing in that.
Well, this is her book, but that particular discussion doesn't occur in the book. I'm just using Karen to elaborate on a point that emerges very, very clearly in the book.
One of the things about the Sunni tradition is almost sort of self-consciously, perhaps, it doesn't, as you've mentioned, it's not really about suppressing other voices, but in a sense, accentuating sort of...
Some of those other voices would disagree with you, Osama. But yes.
No, I mean...
Sorry, please continue.
Of course, there's a range of what constitutes suppression and what would be... I mean, the notion, for example, that... within certain sort of Shia formation, for example, the notion that there might be certain types of divinization in certain individuals, etc. This is going beyond the question of 12 imams, for example. Yes, that would in a sense be rejected outright. But what I'm trying to
I should say, by the way, certain ideas that we might assume are distinctively Shia.
Yes.
For instance, the notion that the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, never menstruated. You do find those in the later Sunni hadith corpus like Tabarani. Right. I should stress you, sorry for interrupting, but it's an important point. Sunnism is kind of in the process of formation and crystallization. And he appeals to the work of Scott Lucas to say there are really kind of three key features of early Sunnism or proto-Sunnism, this term we've encountered in previous weeks.
Right.
Lucas says it's really three key elements: the collective valorization of the Sahaba, Ta'dil al-Sahaba, also a particular vision of history. So you could say the good guys won, and the caliphs, the Khulafa al-Rashidin won, all evil, and so on.
Right.
And all of the companions, notwithstanding their differences, are ultimately good guys, you could say.
Right.
And thirdly, although he doesn't use this term, Jonathan Brown has spoken about the cult of the Isnad. Right. So how do we validate or derive particular norms? It's really through this particular form of hadith. And now, so this is what makes the earlier proto-Sunnis distinctive. Now, while they are becoming distinctive, and while Sunni identity and the sectarian boundaries are crystallizing, there is a certain amount of sharing. And many people have done work on the Shia or proto-Shia hadith corpus. There is a huge amount of overlap and many shared narrators. And I know Michael Dan has looked at the sharing of narrators.
Right, of course.
Michael Knight himself in the book talks about using the work of Melchert and others, the exclusion of sectarian narrators that really hardens by the end of the 3rd century.
Right.
And other sorts of processes.
The point I'm making, though, I think is a slightly different one. Obviously there are certain points on which, particularly where there's kind of a political sensitivity to a question, that suppression is kind of the default in the way in which any sort of entity will assert themselves in the public sphere. But I think what I'm talking about is the notion that I'm in a sense drawing on my own sort of research areas, question of rebellion, for example, within the Sunni tradition. And, Khalid Abul Fadl has obviously a very important book in that regard. One of the things that he, I think, illustrates very well is that, as you say, it's a very cacophonous it's a series of discordant voices in many respects. But instead of suggesting, as I think in some of the post-classical tradition and much of perhaps even the classical tradition would say that, well, Sunnism is a particular perspective, it's actually, in my estimation, Sunnism is the cacophony, right?
Or the broad tent, if you like.
Or the broad tent. I mean, in a sense, I'm kind of drawing on people like Kroner here, but the notion that, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible. And, this is kind of the...
Within certain constraints.
Within certain constraints. Obviously, you have people like, even Ghazali in his Faisal al-Tafriqa, which is really trying to expand it, really quite broadly.
Yes.
It has a limit. Otherwise, it doesn't have coherence, if you don't...
Yes, and you do find... So, not just in this book, but elsewhere, and you can speak of Knight's corpus, because there are a number of books. He's very kind of interested in this question of Sunni identity and what gets marginalized, what gets left out in the story. Right. Specifically in this book, he explores, using Ash'ari's maqalat, views of those who talk explicitly about the gendering of God's body, or God having a particular corporeal form, or things that would be problematic from a kind of certainly classical Sunni perspective.
It's not necessarily from the Ahl Hadith, but yes. It's complicated, isn't it? I mean, in the earliest period.
It's complicated. A nice summary of one of the things the book is trying to do. Yes, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to highlight that point that, in a sense, it's useful if this book is presenting, Sunnism as cacophonous, in as much as, there is a resistance to thinking, or there's a sort of tendency to think of Sunnism as uniform. And I think, Sunnism, in a sense, doesn't have uniformity on most things. And that's why that's, in a sense, it's raison d'etre. It's about trying to bring people together as much as possible. Again,
yes, I suppose you could say that.
I'm also speaking as an insider within the Sunni tradition, but Shem Jackson, to a certain extent, signals this in his introduction to the Faisal al-Tafriqa, which I recently reread, so it's fresh in my mind, where he basically says that, well, the Sunnis made a choice of whether they should develop an ecclesiastical hierarchy that imposes a single vision, or try and accept as many different voices as possible. And by choosing the latter, they might not be able to have as much unity as as other types of systems, but they they try and keep a broad church, as it were. I use the term.
Yes, if it's up. So yeah, I mean, one of the things he says is, for instance, we might expect, based on the actions of certain Muslims and Muslim groups, that the reverence for elements to do with the cult of saints. So there's a big discussion towards the end of the book about the prophet's body after the prophet. But again, when we look into this, we do find the Hadith corpus embodies competing perspectives.
Right.
And in terms of the development in a particular direction, one of the things that stands out, in a number of places he comments on Ma'mar ibn Rasid's Maghazi. He makes it very clear that Ma'mar's text, in some sense, makes the Prophet's body a profane one, in the sense that it being I think the earliest text he looks at here, it does not seem to have some of the extravagant powers or traits associated with the later text too.
Right.
But already, Ma'mar dies 153 of the Hijra, but already in Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Sa'd, also very early sources, you do have other impulses. He talks about Baraka water, the fact that in some reports the Prophet generates water, usually drinking water, from between his fingers and various things like this.
Right.
So yes, it's
which get
kind of
in the major collections of hadith. Those are very
yes, indeed. So I see a question here that relates to something we were just discussing. So I should take it now, I think. So this is from John Islam. I don't know if you want to put it up on the screen.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Yeah.
No, that's all right. So that's a great question, Don, and I do want to stay focused on the book as much as possible, but it is interested in that theme.
So just in the interest of people who are, re-listening on the podcast, I'll read it out. Okay, so you talk about, so Jan Islam is asking, you talk about the definition of Sunnism as opposed to other denominations. How do Sunnis define it?
Yeah, so I'm not trying to use the term denominations. It has a very Christian sort of resonance, but how do Sunnis divide it? Well, which Sunni are you asking? Many Sunnis would not recognize each other even legitimately as fellow Muslims. And this is something that the Knight is very aware of. I mean, there are elements of this corpus he discusses, as I said, that were perceived as theologically problematic by Sunnis. So all of the reports you find in the Sahih, like God creating Adam fi surati. Well, how do you interpret this? In whose image?
Yes.
And another example, the Prophet's vision of God. So I remember reading, not in this book, but one of the narrations that comes up a long time, discussed by Van Essen, as mentioned in this book, is the vision of a youthful God. So in some reports, the Prophet is reported to have seen a God, and some reports make it explicit that this is a kind of dream vision. Others reports do not mention this.
Right.
But in the form of a boy or in the form of a youth with golden hair and all of this. A scholar like al-Dhahabi says, I remember coming across it in Siyar A'lam al-Nubala, he says something like, this report is fabricated regardless of its isnad. He uses this description, which is quite unusual for Dhahabi. But there were indeed Muslims, some who would, even though the interpretation of the report might be unclear, there were Muslims who defended the authenticity, at least, of this report, even if they interpreted it in various ways. Another example, the controversial interpretation, something that you could say Orientalists with a capital O have discussed, and many Western academicians without an axe to grind, if indeed that's a plausible, if that's a possibility. The interpretation of the verse in Surah Al-Najm, وَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ, he was 2 bow lengths or nearer. Now, who is this a reference to? Who does the pronoun refer to here? Most Sunni theologians and interpreters would say it's Gabriel.
Yeah.
But already in the earliest strand of text, you see it as a reference to God. And in fact, Ibn al-Jawzi, when he's critiquing Abu Ya'la and the other Hanbalites for what he views as their anthropomorphism, he says they interpret this as a reference to God, and this is problematic. And so quite a lot of discussion of anthropomorphism in this book.
Interesting. I mean, so let me just add to what you said in terms of, I mean, you earlier mentioned that, yes, some Sunnis would not consider other Sunnis to be sort of even Muslims. And I think, in a sense, I think that happens most strikingly before this kind of, I think that's a proto-Sunni phenomenon. Perhaps I'm going to have to sort of correct my chronology a little on this, but in a sense, you have narrations from someone like Ahmed saying, "Ra'aytu Rabbi fi surati shabin," or something, and that I saw my Lord in a dream in the image of a young man or a young boy.
Dream is not so problematic.
Right.
The problem is that in some versions of the report, it is not explicitly indicated that this occurred in a dream. Right. So, what you want to do with this, there are many directions you could take this in. You could try to reconcile the reports. Right. Or you could do tarjih, kind of preponderate of prefer one over the other, one version over the other.
But by the time of al-Zahabi, I suspect that basically what you have is for want of a better term, the more anthropomorphizing tendencies within Ahl al-Hadith and the Hanabila have been, in a sense, brought into a reconciliation with the speculative theologians who are kind of somewhere between them and the Mu'tazila, right? And that's kind of Sunnism. And those are very opposing tendencies that will look to each other as Ahl al-Bid'ah very often, but still, within the broad Sunni umbrella. So that's,
even within Hanbalism itself,
I wonder to what extent it's true that they would actually look to each other and say, "You're not Muslim." I know that takes place even to this day. I mean, you have in a place like the Indian subcontinent, you have different groups of Muslims who will call other, people who are themselves Hanafi and Maturidi and
yes, I mean the Brahmanis regarding the Deobandis is not Muslim.
The debates, they'll call them non-Muslim, and so it's very perhaps the way I should frame this is Sunnism is in constant formation, right?
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. But there are some things they share. You cannot be a Sunni and denounce Omar, as discussed in the book, and as Scott Lewis, and denounce Omar as a kind of false caliph or something like this.
Right.
So there are some constitutive features, but within that, there's a huge amount of diversity.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. And in some ways, because he's interested again in this question of sectarian identity and boundary formation, and you could even say canonization in terms of especially the 6 books of Sunni Hadith. And he does discuss, referring to the work of Jonathan Brown in particular, when they become canonical and so on. And some viewed it as 5 books, and Ibn Majah had a slightly dubious status among the so-called canon, and so on. But there are some things about the Prophet's body, we almost take for granted by virtue of this canon. So certain, although it's not as though even the 6 books themselves necessarily always privilege one perspective on things, by virtue of omission and selection, they do clearly privilege a particular view often. So, for instance, we know in the 6 books that the earth does not consume the bodies of prophets. Right. So the suggestion is that the bodies of prophets do not decay. They're not subject to the regular processes of decay and decomposition of other bodies. Right. But again, if you look beyond the canon, as it were, to texts like Ibn Sa'd, he mentions, again, even in Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat himself, competing views. So, again, a suggestion that prophetic bodies are not subject to these rules. Mm-hmm. But Al-Abbas says, that the Prophet's body will decompose like any other. Right. And
interesting. And
yes. Yeah. So even, it's not that we're able to easily reconstruct an original view, because already when you go to early sources, you do often have these competing and even contradictory voices. These kind of competing voices, yes.
Yeah. No, sorry, I was just saying, and further challenging is sometimes you have the same person having contradictory views attributed to them as well.
Yes. Yeah. In this book, one of the interesting things is on more than one issue he explores the perspective of a particular Sahabi. So a great example is Aisha. Right. And he doesn't claim any historicity to this, but Aisha's perspective, or the views attributed to her, seem to emerge with a certain amount of consistency. So, for instance, she is, and also her voice is quite distinctive on a range of issues relating to bodies and the Prophet's body, in particular. So, for example, she consistently denies that the Prophet saw God in his lifetime, against other views attributed to other companions. And curiously, in some sources, she's even reported to have seen Gabriel herself. And in some reports, she says, these are quite later ones, that she was the only woman to have seen the angel Gabriel. In some reports, you find Ibn Abbas having been said to have seen Jibreel alayhi salam. So,
right.
Yes, to some extent, these voices do emerge as distinctive, but you're right, you have competing and contrasting views as well, attributed to the same person.
And what's interesting about later Sunnism, in my estimation, is when you get to these sort of more encyclopedic scholars like al-Dhahabi or Ibn Hajar comes to mind, Ibn Taymiyyah, that these people, in a sense, will reference all of these and kind of not always insist that there's one correct opinion on this. They'll just say, look, there's, did the Prophet see God? Well, this is the view of Aisha, and this is the view of such and such a person. And we have two riwayas from Ibn Abbas, and we don't have a chronology there. And therefore, we don't really
I should say that particular issue is doctrinally safe and uncontroversial.
Right.
These will recognize that the Prophet may or may not have seen God, and the companions disagreed about it. But what about other areas? So he does touch on some very.
Could you maybe give some good examples, if that's right, of doctrinally unsafe, so to speak?
Well, I should stress all of these things are found in the Sunni Hadith corpus. It's not like light has brought them from nowhere.
Right.
So in some respects, you could say they are part of the broad Islamic heritage.
Yeah.
So, for instance, some people would find problematic the idea that in some reports, the Prophet's body, the Sahaba did not begin to bury it or did not decide to bury it until it showed signs of beginning to undergo the normal processes one associates with death. So, for instance, he talks about the bloating of his stomach, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many people would be uncomfortable discussing this.
Yes, and that would be
understandable reasons.
Where is that reported? I'm just wondering.
Gosh, off the top of my head, I do not remember, but specifically the decay issue one does find. Now, another, particularly in the modern context, because something Omid Safi has talked about, both in his kind of envisioning of the Seerah and elsewhere, is most Muslims historically have not approached the life of the Prophet ﷺ as a work of Rankian history, this kind of exercise in archive and what have you. But they've approached the Prophet as not just an exemplary man, which is all of our view as Muslims in various ways, but as a kind of cosmic figure. Think especially in the post-classical period, as a man of light. I remember this Brelwi Sirah work that I've seen in mosques several times, called The Shadowless Prophet, that underplay, the human elements, you could say, of the Prophet's life. Now, to some extent, all people recognize at least an element of the Prophet's humanities. But how far does this go? And one example, one thing, if I could make one point about the book, where maybe it's just a suggestion for further research rather than a criticism or disagreement with the book. There are important early sources, such as, to mention it, to flog a dead horse, the Kitab al-Tahrish of Dirar ibn Amr, because it is so early, because it is 2nd century, which was published, I think, after the dissertation was submitted, but perhaps before the manuscript for this book was submitted. So I don't know about the timing of all of this. The author may not have had access to it for various reasons, but some of our earliest records of debates, for example, about Muhammad sallallahu qabla an yuha ilay, as the editor titles the chapter of the book. What status did the Prophet have before his prophethood? He refers to the really interesting paper of Maya J. Kister, suggesting, for instance, that the Prophet, when he was a youth, many years before his commissioning as a prophet, ate, or this report discussing his eating meat that had been sacrificed to an idol. Now, already in the Sunni Hadith corpus, there are clear attempts to counter this. If you look at Dirar bin Amr, whose text, his Tahrish predates nearly all of the sources Knight addresses, you already see this cacophony. Why? You already see Sunnis, or not even Sunnis, you already see Muslims who are claiming that no, the Prophet was protected even before his commissioning as a prophet around the age of 40 from not only participating in idolatrous worship, but any kind of problematic behavior.
Right.
And you see other voices saying other things. I mean, to some extent, I suppose you could even do this with the Quran. Something that Shab Ahmed in his book, Before Orthodoxy, which we may one day have an episode on, also looks at some length. So you had, in any kind of big tafsir work, you'll find a discussion of all of these verses about prophets and their actions. How the Sunnis understand the fact that prophets are reported to have done various things, including things that might be understood as sins, or even, Ibn Hazm.
Before, obviously, before they
yes. Yes. Although not in all cases. So the famous case, for instance, of the Prophet Dawood alayhi salam, the story in the Hebrew Bible of David and Bathsheba. Now it occurs even in the tafsir, and there's an excellent book on this we should have an episode on by Khalil Muhammad. Already in the tafsir literature, the version of the David Bathsheba story is very different from what you get in the Hebrew Bible. Nobody accuses David of any kind of impropriety in that in the sense that the Bible does.
Yes.
But authors like Al-Azami kind of still have to square the circle somehow.
I mean, there are so many things going on with the formation of a sort of doctrinal canon, so to speak. In the early period, I'm sure, and this is a late antique context as well. So there are going to probably be, disagreements even at the time of Dara ibn Amr, about what the memory is of the Prophet ﷺ. That's pretty early. So in a sense, I think you also signal the fact that, for Muslims, the study of the Prophet wasn't just a process of history. It's an act of devotion.
Yes, of course.
And when we utter the name of the Prophet, we say Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We don't usually just say Muhammad, because the Quran says, he does sometimes refer to him as the Prophet, sometimes he refers to him as Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So you have a kind of range of registers or ways of referring to him. And as a consequence of that, it does change the nature of the conversation. Obviously, there's the impression I get that Michael Muhammad Knight is hopefully also alerting the reader of just that dimension, that in a sense inescapable dimension of the study of the Prophet. But I can give an example of that I think illustrates the point. He discusses this, especially in the introduction. For him, it's clear that scholarship isn't just philological fireworks or spadework or whatever. Right.
It's not an armchair exercise, and any Muslim will have some kind of investment in the Prophet as indeed Michael Knight does, and he's shown this in various works of his. One way in which that comes out in this book is in the introduction. He explores his kind of commitments as a Muslim feminist author, and like in a number of works, for instance, Aisha Chaudhry in her important book on domestic violence in the Islamic tradition, or indeed Aisha Hidayatullah in her equally kind of challenging and important book, Feminist Edges of the Quran. In what sense are you invested in things like, for instance, the angels being genderless, or even God? And I spoke about this debate about the vision of God the Prophet may or may not have had, and in what form he sees him. One of the things that Knight finds troubling, although he discusses it very frankly, and he says, in some sense, he doesn't want to rob feminist Muslim scholars or even just Muslims generally of a resource they may find dear. So one always has to be alive to the implications of knowledge and what impact it might have on people. Right. And other authors I mentioned are very explicit about this, and knowledge can always be appropriated and misappropriated for, you could say, nefarious purposes. So He finds, for instance, when the angels are discussed, although any work of Islamic theology will say, for instance, they are genderless and so on, that they are always, or almost always, depicted in gender terms, certainly when they become embodied. So whenever the Prophet or his companions encounter the angel Gabriel, he's always a male.
Right.
And he's a very kind of particular kind of male, very excessively dark hair and the skin and so on. This gendering also has implications for how we understand the Prophet. Now, in many contexts today, there is a certain reluctance to talk about specific aspects of the Prophet's life, and it's partly the power relations that exist in our world, and this self-consciousness Muslims have when they speak about issues that in the modern period are kind of tricky for whatever reason, or controversial. So Muslims have internalized this critique that Orientalists in the 19th century make of the Prophet as kind of as manly, as red-blooded, if you will. Now, one thing he discusses here is, in many reports, and this is something one finds quite consistently throughout the Hadith corpus, the Prophet is celebrated by his companions as virile, as preeminently masculine, and he cites variants, 35 or 40, or I think 30 times various numbers are given the strength of other men in terms of particular ability. Now, for them, that was something to be celebrated. It was not a source of shame. But the Prophet's body is preeminently a male one. Another aspect in which, partly as a result of the colonial gaze, but not entirely, is how one views particular substances. So I don't think many Muslims, at least, would have problems with the idea of the Prophet's saliva conveying barakah. Barakah, by the way, is one of the key, along with the idea of the study of bodies, on both of which subjects barakah and the body, and he defines barakah in various ways. The focus of past scholarship has really been on Sufism. So he kind of brings this discourse, these frames of inquiry, to interrogate the Hadith corpus specifically. So that's one of the original contributions of the book. But what about other substances? I remember reading, I think Ali Gomar being asked about, what do we do about this report where somebody drinks the urine of the Prophet? That sounds very odd. Not least for reasons of ritual purity. In many reports, the Prophet clearly regarded urine as both dirty and ritually impure. And when the Bedouin urinates in the mosque, you can't just pray, you have to cleanse it away. And an interesting report also that Knight mentions where, although the companions regarded or reported to have regarded the Prophet ﷺ's sweat as fragrant and even to have bottled it and kind of kept it, there is one report in which the Prophet wears a kind of wool garment, a black wool garment, and he sweats in it, and this makes a smell, and he's reported as not having liked the smell and having discarded the garment, which might suggest that the Prophet didn't necessarily see himself in that way. So again, an emphasis on the diversity of voices, but there is a discussion of urine and something. It's really something that emerges only later in the period, especially 4th century texts.
You mean in collections that come later?
Yes, so Tabarani's various Ma'ajim, for example, and in many of the reports, the drinking is, or in some of them at least, the drinking is accidental. So Ayman is looking around for something to drink, as we do sometimes get up in the middle of the night for a glass of water, and then she finds a vessel. Yes, and
the thing that I was throwing away, and she said,
and in one report, he saw Hassan laughs, opening his mouth so wide that his molars are visible. It's kind of funny episode if you think about it. And in some, the drinking of the Prophet's blood can even be regarded as foreshadowing danger, or kind of giving us a sense of foreboding. So in one report, the Prophet is cupped, and he disposes of his blood normally by pouring it away or having it buried, as he does with hair and fingernails, other waste products. Because the Prophet seems to have regarded these as waste products, according to these reports. And in one report, Abdullah ibn Zubair is kind of charged with getting rid of this blood, and he drinks
I
it.
assume it's a late report, relatively.
Again,
Some of them.
I don't recall, but what is the significance of his drinking it? Now, in some variants, I would say the majority of the variants Knight mentions, the Prophet sees this as a bad sign, and of course we all know what happens to Abdullah ibn Zubair and the besieging of the Haram and so on.
But there's also a report, I mean, this is from the Battle of Uhud, if I recall correctly, when they are kind of pinned down in kind of mountain or something, and
also mentioned in the book.
Pulls out sort of the
Prophet kind of rings of chainmail, I think it is, from and the blood kind of flows, and he
drinks the blood, and the Prophet actually praises him for it or something like that. This is in the Surah, at least.
Yes, so you do find elements of this in other things. Things like urine kind of occur much later, and their meaning is not always straightforward.
Right.
So in some variants of that report involving Ayman, he says, he might laugh and say you've been protected from the fire, because something that Knight emphasizes multiple times is, in a very literal way, you are what you eat, right? So in the same way that in some reports, when Hind bint Utbah chews the liver of Hamza, she's unable to swallow it. Why? In some discussions, it's made explicit, because God would not punish any part of Hamza with the fire. Right. And by virtue of eating and digesting that liver, she would in some sense have a part of Hamza inside her. So yes.
So I want to change tack slightly, and I recognize Jazakumullah khairan for the comments and the questions, and we're going to get to them in just a moment. But I wanted to sort of think a little bit about authenticity and perhaps present a speculative sort of reading of my own. As someone who's not actually read the book in the first place, but about
go away and read it. I think it's a very interesting, sometimes provocative, but always interesting read.
I hope to read it, and you've mentioned that it's actually remarkably short as a piece of work. So
no, I mean not overly short, but it's well written enough that it's a book you can kind of finish in a sitting, because it's well read, it's accessible.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't mean in any way to sort of talk.
I should say concise would be the best way of expressing it, because if you look at the range of texts consulted, I mean, many hours of just sifting texts and reading through them from al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's work, which is no small text. The major part of the Sunni Hadith corpus, at least.
Right. Now, the main point that I'm trying to suggest, and this is something which, alhamdulillah, I spent a good deal of time studying hadith with a scholar who's recently published a very large book, Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, who's a very accomplished scholar of hadith. And I remember him sort of once telling us in class, you should all read Siyar A'lam al-Nubala. And, at the time we were novices, so to speak, and we were like, how long is it? And he said, it's about 24 volumes. And and he was saying it with a straight face. I mean, he was saying that, look, I've read the whole book. Some of the volumes I've read 7 or 8 times. And this was, 10-15 years ago. So I suspect, he used to be a fellow at the Centre for Islamic Studies when I was an undergraduate at Oxford. And I would regularly see him walking, because he'd walk to work and walk back home. I'd regularly see him walking on the streets of Oxford, carrying a volume of Siyar A'lam al-Nubala and reading it. So it was kind of just his daily habit of constantly going through the text.
And one of the great things about al-Dhahabi is he's attentive to all of these different layers and reports. And he's a kind of critical scholar who sifts this information.
But not just that. I mean, the later Sunni hadith masters in particular, people like al-Dhahabi, people like Ibn Hajar and so on, they put a premium on, authenticity. And I'm not someone who's studied this to the depth to be able to say this, as someone who's an expert speaking with authority, but, referring to these kinds of experts within the Sunni canon, there's a recognition that there's a reason why the 6 books are the 6 books, so to speak. And Ibn Majah kind of joins in later on. And obviously Jami' al-Usul has, I think, another text, I can't recall, maybe Muwatta of Imam Malik or something. And that canonicity is largely by virtue of the reliability of those sources. So in a sense, what I'd like to suggest is the variation that we have, and the later another comment that scholars of hadith, and this might be sort of my own biases as someone trained in 21st century Sunni conceptions of how the canon developed in terms of the hadith canon. The later sources are not as reliable as the earlier ones, in a sense. This doesn't go across the board, but the Muwatta is considered reliable, but it's not really a collection of hadith, it's hadith and fiqh. So when you get to the 6 books, after the 6 books, once you get to, obviously Tabarani is just a collector. He's also highly unreliable when it comes to, he does constant mudallis and things like this.
But I should say, and this is relevant to the book, I mean,
not to say that they don't have material.
I mean, some of the texts you find in Tabarani's Mu'jam that don't appear in the 6 books appear in Dirar ibn Amr's Kitab Tahrish already in the 2nd century.
Right. But
so
again,
and one thing he says in the book is, later sources do occasionally preserve early material, stuff that you wouldn't find in sources that were earlier. I mean,
there's no question. Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, Bayhaqi's Sunan al-Kubra, which he uses quite a lot.
Yeah.
By scholars like Motsky has been used to reconstruct some of these isnad trees.
Right.
And Bayhaqi frequently preserves in that text, because it's voluminous, I think 30,000 reports or something like this. He preserves variants of isnad, and I've seen this myself in my own research, that complement and illuminate material you find with much shorter isnads in earlier works. It's not that later authorities don't necessarily preserve early material. Now, yes, there is certainly a change in direction, and some of the extravagance or some of the trends we find frankly awkward do sometimes only appear in these later sources. But even in the early period, as I've tried to stress, and as Knight stresses in the book, you do find a certain amount of diversity.
Absolutely.
Already.
And what I'd add to that is, in talking about this kind of gradation of the sort of the authority of what becomes canonized in the Sunni tradition within the 6 books, for example, and the relative, non-canonicity of the other texts, is not to say that, if you go to any great authority of the later centuries, they're using all of these sources. Ibn Hajar is constantly looking at all of these sources and trying to find material that is beyond the 6 books in those sources. I mean, in our own time, of course, you have major efforts by Salafis to look for all the Sahih hadiths beyond the 6 books, for example, which are interesting as a project unto itself. It's in a sense not been tried in that way. And of course, you have people like, I forget, Al-Haythami, Nuruddin Al-Haythami, and all of these sorts of things.
So you mentioned that point earlier about, from my 21st century perspective on Sunnism. Now, already in the kind of formative period of Sunnism or proto-Sunnism or the Al-Hadith, we see this concern with criticality and sifting. This is what distinguishes someone like Yahya ibn Ma'in and Ibn Hanbal from others to some extent. But that is not the vision even of all Sunnis. And barring, some of these major, this efflorescence, you could say, of the hadith sciences and expertise. Of course, we still haven't really studied later periods. And I know Garrett Davidson's work, we should probably have an episode on. He discusses post-classical hadith transmission. It's a really important book that came out recently. But in most periods, most of the time, my impressionistic sense is, and some scholars have commented on this, like Ben al-Sadiq, when he talks about fiqh, he talks about the general speaking, the insulation of hadith studies from fiqh. So hadith criticism was not, in many periods of Sunnism, was not a mainstay of the curriculum, or famously Ghazali and the various criticisms that have been made of his kind of want of hadith criticism, and that's by no means a marginal work, the Ihya in the Sunni imagination, Sunni religious imagination. And I would like to suggest, and I'd be welcome to be corrected on this point, that this seems to have been the norm, not the exception.
That's the impression I get as well. I mean, and this is what's really fascinating, because as you say, people pick on Ghazali, I think, a little unfairly, because you go to any work of fiqh as well, and these people aren't really, I mean, this is Shaykh Akram's comment when we were studying Hanafi fiqh with them. He's saying, look, these people aren't studying hadith. The hadith they're quoting are just the ones that have been quoted by their fiqh teachers. that have been quoted by their fiqh teachers. And
so this is exactly the kind of insulation Sadeghi talks about. Now,
Yeah.
another book, not to distract from Knight's important achievement in this text, but
Right.
Ahmed Hamda, in his forthcoming book, I mean, based on my somewhat familiarity with his other work,
Right.
who looks at the contribution of al-Albani. Now, it would be an exaggeration to say al-Albani single-handedly revived the study of hadith in the 20th century, but his contribution is huge.
Massive.
I would say clearly, I would say probably larger than any single figure. And I mean, beginning in the 1950s and onwards, and he reads Rashid Rida's criticism of or discussion of the Ihya, and it's kind of authenticity problem, as it were.
Right.
But what I want to stress, again, following on this point, Mike, the Knight insists on throughout the book, is Sunnism is a kind of process.
Mm-hmm.
Or as a broad church of the term is not inappropriate.
Yeah.
It's a process that continues to unfold, as you said, Usama. Now, to turn quickly to this question by Yusuf al-Afifi, if you would bring it up.
On the screen, and I'll just read it out if that's all right. So, Yusuf al-Afifi, I mean, he was addressing a discussion we were having about half an hour ago, of course. Surely there is an identifiable limit to the anthropomorphism that is held as a common denominator among Sunnis. So I don't know.
Yes, there is, absolutely. But again, different Sunnis will differ on their perspectives on this. So, for instance, in the theological work of al-Darimi, who writes against Bishr al-Marisi and so on, he says particular things about God's distinction from creation and God being ba'in min khalqihi and distinct from creation, physically distinct. And being separate.
Sahib al-Sunan?
No, he's often confused with him, but this is Uthman bin Sa'id al-Darimi, who dies in 280, I think.
Okay.
The Sahib al-Sunan dies in 255. So there are statements in his book against Bishr al-Marisi that Zahid al-Kawthari, the kind of modern Ash'ari figure, says this is Kitab al-Zayr so he denounces it as a work of a blasphemous work.
Right.
Fakhr al-Din al-Razi calls Ibn Khuzaymah's Kitab al-Tawheed Kitab al-Shirk, if I remember rightly, or Kitab al-Zayr. Right, so Sunnis,
anthropomorphism,
yes, for charges of anthropomorphism. Now, there are some things that I suppose all people who identify as Sunnis would agree about. So, the Prophet did not become incarnated in, any man or any person, right? So
God didn't.
God did not become. Confusing that. God did not become incarnated in any person. So this is a belief held by so-called, as they refer to, Ghulat, extreme Shi'i sects, and this would expel one from the fold of Islam in the view of Shi'i theologians as well, many Shi'i theologians.
Right.
But within Sunnism, there are, there is an outer boundary, but within that there is disagreement, if that helps.
And that disagreement can be very broad and sometimes very sort of acrimonious.
Yes,
with
indeed.
People. I was just, Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi is very uncompromising, for example, about. And I get this impression from people like Abul Qasim al-Qushayri and when Ash'arism kind of came of its own in that period.
Yeah, I mean, again, different views on what Ash'arism is. Knight speaks about Asma in this book, and I mean, we've already looked at some examples of this earlier in the episode, but because it's not relating to the Prophet's body, one example he doesn't bring up is, the passage in the Quran discussing Ibrahim alayhi salam seeing the stars and the moon and so on and saying Hada Rabbi, Hada Akbar, and what have you. A figure like Ibn Hazm says anybody who says that Ibrahim actually believed that his Lord was the stars or the moon or what have you is an apostate and yustatab and all of this. So,
fascinating.
And if you really want a kind of insight into the kind of world, the interpretive world generated by these verses, and how Sunnism shifts to kind of exclude some of these interpretations, read just Tabari's tafsir on any of these episodes. But we are kind of coming towards the end. We're already at the end of the episode.
If it's okay, I'm just going to, there was one other comment, and I just wanted to read it out. It's a very kind comment from Aisha Saeed. So I just thought I'd read it. She says, this is a difficult topic of discussion, highly sensitive for some religious sensibilities, especially in the subcontinent. She's writing from Pakistan, as I recall. And so thank you for presenting it in an academic manner. And Jazakumullah khairan. I hope that we've tried to be sensitive. Obviously, we're both Muslims. So we consider the Prophet an object of veneration naturally.
Of course.
And so, but at the same time, these issues can, particularly in the Indian subcontinent where I'm from as well, the other end, of course, it can be a deeply emotive and sometimes sort of violent issue. So. So I hope that we've contributed to a reasonable discussion, inshallah.
Yes, and I would say in the book, it is. I can't think of the tone ever being inappropriate or anything like this. And as I said, all of the texts discussed are featured in various ways in the Sunni Hadith corpus. Knight's job, you could say, is not to privilege one vision over the other, but to explore this diversity of views and how depictions of the Prophet ﷺ and his body kind of shift over time or remain consistent. And in those respects, it's a very successful work, I'd say.
Perhaps if I can add a sort of an interesting to what you've just said, which is, because I've just finished writing a review of Abdul Hakim Murad's Traveling Home. Perhaps I can share it with you at some point. But one of the things that he complains about in modern sort of academia, including in Islamic studies, kind of hinted at, is that it's all sociological. It's all about sort of analysis and empirical sort of like presenting of data and so on. There's no commitment to truth. And that's an interesting sort of critique, which it's made me reflect. It's something, obviously, because of my own training as an alim, I'm, in a sense, studying these sorts of things originally when I pursued Islamic studies in that sort of a setting. It was so that I could live my life in accord with a truth, so to speak.
Okay.
And so
I should stress, Knight is not naive about objectivity and so on.
Absolutely. No.
Evidently. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the current sort of discussions and debates within these sort of social sciences are very much alive to this complexity of the context we live in, and we've reflected on this briefly as well. So, but I just thought I'd throw that there. It's an interesting, perspective from a scholar who's Sheikh Abdul Hakim. Jan Islam is asking which book is this. It's called Traveling Home. Essays.
Series of essays by Abdul Hakim Murad. Yeah, it's an interesting question. You do sense. I don't know if it's a fair comment, but in this and other works of Knight, a certain, especially once he received his academic training, very much in the framework of religious studies, it does tend to generate a certain skepticism about notions of truth and objectivity. And so on. So I suppose to some extent that comes across in this work, but the book is really a catalogue of this kind of cacophony of voices. He does talk a bit about Shi'i voices as well. Perhaps in further work there could be more discussion of this.
Inshallah, we could go on for a long time about that sort of conversation. But Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. I really appreciate this very thoughtful reflection on what's obviously a very important contribution.
Yes, to this and then thank you, of course, to the author for having written it. I really enjoyed it. I was fascinated by the book. And
inshallah, we hope to be back in a week's time. So I'm sure you have another book lined up.
Yes. This is Suhaira Siddiqi's, and I'll hold it up to the screen. Exciting and very important book on al-Juwayni, Law and Politics under the Abbasids, an intellectual portrait of al-Juwayni, which focuses mostly on his legal theory and theology, the two areas where I think he made the most important contributions to classical Islamic thought.
We also ought to sort of, again, apologize for not really having a female author up until this point. It really is
Yes, that is purely my fault, and it is a function of my very limited time for reading the book. So as a result of that, the next few weeks will be devoted purely to female authors. And, we have an embarrassment of riches, so it's not as if we're constrained for choice. There are many excellent works written by that half of the human race, you could say.
Jazakumullah khairan. Barakallahu fikum. And Omar, I look forward to seeing you in a week's time, and I look forward to seeing everyone else. Please do sort of feel free to share these episodes with friends, or let them know that they can subscribe on a platform like YouTube, and then they would be notified of the weekly broadcast. But until next week, inshallah, we look forward to seeing you. Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.